All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the React Native workshop for Hack at Home. My name's Elle,
And I'm David.
and today we'll be showing you React Native and how to develop your own app through React Native. So to start off, let's talk about what React Native is. It is a framework for building native apps, which you might think of as phone apps, in React, which is a popular JavaScript library. For reference, we'll be using JavaScript today. It might be helpful to know a little bit of basic JavaScript. React Native is an easy cross-platform development tool, which lets developers really easily make apps that can run on both Android and iOS without having to do a lot of code conversion or anything like that. Next, we'll talk about Expo CLI. This is the environment we're going to use, or framework that lets us actually develop, build, and deploy React applications. It'll allow us to kind of easily set up our environment and then deploy easily to both iOS or Android devices, depending on what we want to do with this project. To start out, you may want to pick up, if you have an iPhone or an Android, pick it up and download the Expo app from the App Store or Google Play Store. We'll be using it later to help us test out our app. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can actually run the apps through those, the Expo client app later. All right, to start out, we'll talk about what you need to do to actually set up React with Expo, which, as I mentioned, is kind of our development environment. So if you're using NPM, you can run something like npm install -g expo CLI. And with yarn, you can use the other command that's on screen. You may need to install React Native or React DOM dependencies. If you do need to do that, instructions will be usually given to you on the screen, or you can search those up. All right. Yeah, so once you have your environment set up, we can get right into actually making our project. So creating a project is pretty simple. We follow the steps on screen using Expo to kind of initialize our directory. And I'll let David take it from here to show you how it's actually done.
Yeah, so I can go ahead and start showing you. So you'd want to open up your terminal, first of all. Just go into the location of where you want the folder in the project to be. For me, I'll just have it in my documents. And then, as Elle had mentioned, we're going to want to first install the Expo CLI. So for me, I can just use npm. If you do not have npm installed, you want to go ahead and first install node.js, which will automatically install npm as well. So as mentioned earlier, if you take a look at the code, the line you just want to run is npm install.g expo.cli. And then it'll go ahead and download that for you. And then we can give that a second. And then once this finishes, then we're going to go ahead and start creating our actual project. So now, assuming that you have successfully installed the Expo client, that might take a couple minutes if it's your first time. Don't worry too much about that. We're just going to move on from that point. So now we're going to want to create our actual product, or our actual project. So going into a folder that you'd want your project in, type expo init. And then for our project, we can just go ahead and call it to-do list. And then we can go ahead and create that. So that'll actually make the project. And then we can just go ahead and click blank. So hit enter, and then it'll choose that template for you. And then it'll start actually downloading all the necessary dependencies. It should download React Native for you. If it doesn't, as Elle had mentioned earlier, you can go ahead and install that yourself. And then it'll download the necessary project files as well. Okay, so now that your project has completely downloaded, we're going to want to go into that project. So you can just cd into whatever you called it. So ours would be to-do list. And then now you're going to be in the to-do list project file. So if you ls, you'll see all these different folders and files, and then we can go into those in further detail later. But for now, let's just go with npm start, or you can you can use expo start as well. So I'm going to go ahead and use npm start. And what that should do is that it should open up on your browser. So ours is on our Chrome browser. This page, which basically is Expo's way of running the program. So as we had mentioned earlier, ideally you would have the Expo client app or Expo downloaded on your phone, and then you can go ahead and use your camera or the built-in scanner to scan this QR code, and it should run the app. So for us, because we have it on our laptops, we're going to use the web browser runner. But then for all of you guys, we recommend taking a picture or using your camera to scan the QR code instead. So it should look, your page should look something like this, whether it's on your phone or whether it's on the actual the web developer, the web browser, which I used. So it should go ahead and look like this. So this is kind of the home starting base of it. And then we can go ahead and dive into the app.js code to edit it and make it look like what we want it to. So we can ideally open a new tab in our terminal. And then from here, we're going to want to open our text. So if you take a look at this, this is the app.js file. So basically the app.js file is kind of it's the main home basis kind of file that is run in order to kind of render what you're going to actually see on your phone screen. So if you see, we have right here, the open up app.js to start working on your app is exactly what we were viewing here. So if you take a look at this block of code here, so this is actually something we call JSX. It's written, React uses JSX in order to combine HTML and JavaScript in some way. So it's mostly JavaScript, but it allows for this HTML-like syntax, such as views and then text, and then later we'll have text inputs, we'll have buttons, all that kind of stuff. So that's basically what most of React Native is going to look like, is this JSX.
Okay, great. So now we've got our project set up and we have kind of our basic understanding of what code we're going to be using. Let's talk about the actual building blocks of React Native, which are components. If you have worked with or are coming from React.js, you're probably pretty familiar with components. They work very similarly in React Native as in React.js. Excuse me. So like I mentioned, components are building blocks for our app. They're going to help us produce visual or functional elements. Think of them kind of the same way as, say, elements in HTML, like divs, p, blocks, inputs, forms, things like that. Components come in two different types. They can be function or class-based. We'll introduce those as we kind of get into our code. And the whole idea of using components to build up a React Native project or any React project is that they let us render things very quickly, since components can be rendered separately when they change instead of having to re-render the whole app every single time something changes. Lastly, we're also going to see how we can make our own components. But to start out, let's use some of the built-in components that come with React Native, such as view and text, which, David, if you want to switch back to our app.js file, we actually already can see in our starter code. If you're familiar with HTML, view is pretty similar to div. It just creates a container. And text is similar to just like a p tag. It creates a block of text that is rendered pretty typically. You may notice, as I mentioned, or as David mentioned earlier with the HTML style syntax, we have these nested tags. If you're not familiar with HTML, all that means is, or all that we can see here is we have a view tag and then a closing view tag with a slash, and everything in between those two tags is code that's going to be kind of contained in that view element or contained in that container.
So if you notice down here, something that we haven't mentioned yet is the style sheet, which is a lot is similar to CSS, but it's a little different in its syntax. You can go ahead and look at the React Native docs for more information. We won't be going too much into it. The code will be available in the GitHub repository. And so you can go ahead and just copy paste the style codes for the different elements that we'll be creating.
All right, so let's get into actually changing up some of the source code and adding in parts of this app and kind of customizing what we're looking at. So to start out really simply, let's try changing the text, for example, on this screen to say something like hello world, and then seeing how our development environment will update. Okay, so notice our text is updated and we can see none of the styling has since we haven't changed any of that. If you have your environment set up correctly, whenever you save a file, it should update the development preview, even if you're using the phone app. So that's a really helpful, helpful thing that the development environment will do for you. All right, so today we'll be making a to-do list app, kind of an app that'll help us manage some to-do tasks. So to start out, let's start building the custom components we'll need for this app by making a custom component that kind of comprises our header. So as David's going to show you right now, we're going to go ahead and make a folder for our custom components just to help us organize things a little better. This is by no means necessary, but it's pretty conventional. In this components folder, let's go ahead and add our actual component file. We'll need to give it a name that matches what it is. So in this case, we'll call it header.js. And now let's talk about some of the things we need to set up for a custom component. We'll start out by making a functional component. So to do that, the first things we'll need to make sure we're importing React, as well as importing any components we want to use from React, such as text or view.
We will also be needing style sheet later in order to kind of customize the way it looks. So you want to make sure you import that. And these will be imported from React Native.
Right. Okay, perfect. And now we'll get to writing the actual component. A functional component is pretty simple. It really only has one important part, which is the function part that is returning what it's rendering. So we'll go ahead and make that function now. We'll start out by saying, export default, which if you know JavaScript has to do with how we're going to be passing this information out of the file. And then we'll name it header to match the component name we've already given it. Okay, and to keep things simple, let's make this component return the components it was already rendering in app, so that same view and text, and we'll just take out the other element that was there that we don't need anymore.
Got it. So here we see that we exported this function, which is the header, and the header returns our view, which is kind of like our div, and it contains the text, which is hello world, which should mirror what we see here, this view and this text.
Right, exactly. And now that we have it set up, even if very bare bones, let's see how we would actually render this header. Like David mentioned, app.js is sort of our main rendering file. So if we want anything to be shown in the app, it has to be rendered somehow through this file. So we'll start out by changing the main function of this app to render a header component instead of the view and text it was before.
So in order to get that header to actually render, we're going to want to import it kind of onto this file. So we can import header. We can just call it header. And then we want to import it from, and then right here, we want to put the file path to header. So this // will go back to the home component. And then remember, we had put it within the components folder. So you would go under components, and then we want to find the name of the JavaScript file, which is header. So this right here is basically the file path to this header.js file. And it allows us to get whatever was exported from here onto here, which is this header function. So from app.js, all we have to do now is this imported header. We want to put it in here as a component. So Ella, if you want to talk a little more about what exactly we are doing here.
Yeah, so we're going to use those HTML-like tags with the angle brackets that we saw before we were using for text and view. And we'll need 2 of them. And then there is the option to put nodes in between them. We won't talk about that right now. Yeah. If you want to just, if you have a component that doesn't actually need anything between the 2 tags, you don't need any children, you can actually render it in 1 tag, the way David has right here. All right, so now that we have our header component sort of set up in our app.js, let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like. So you'll notice that our development view has updated. We can see our hello world text. Notice we've lost our styling since we are no longer using the kind of built-in components from the start. So let's go ahead and add those back into our header.js file. since styling is going to be a part of the view component we're rendering here.
So this block of code here was just copy pasted from our repository. You can do the same thing. And we'll be applying this header and text styling to the view and the text here.
Right. One thing to note that you'll see David use here is that when we want to put JavaScript code into JSX-like tags, we'll need to use this like curly brace around it, and that allows you to basically inject JavaScript code wherever you want. So here we're trying to reference the styles variable and its header field, so we'll need to use those curly braces to ensure that it's not being rendered as straight HTML-like text.
So if you notice the styles.header, the reason why that is what we use to get this information is because styles is actually, if you notice, it's going to be a JavaScript object, and header is one of the items in the JavaScript object. So you can index into it by doing styles.header, and that'll return the proper styling sheet. So we can go ahead and check our app out now. So we see it's centered. It's in the middle, kind of the way we want it in our final app.
All right, so now let's say we're building this as part of an app and we want to actually customize our header based on the title of our app. So let's really quickly take a little break to talk about props in React and how they're going to work in our project. Again, if you're familiar with React.js, this may sound very familiar. It works exactly the same as it does in React.js. But for those of you who are new to React, props is short for properties, and it's a name for information we can pass to a React component, customize or not, on creation. They kind of allow us to customize components by giving them certain information, such as in this case, what we want the title of this header to, what we want the header to display as text, what we want the title of this app to be. So in this case, let's see how we can add a prop to our header component so that it renders the text that we give to it from app.js instead of this hard-coded text it's doing right now. So to do that, we'll need to add props to the input of this function. This is kind of a built-in input. React Native will know what it means. And then instead of reacting hello world, instead of rendering hello world, we'll want to render specifically a text field of props. And we'll show you what that looks like in a second from app.js.
So from our app.js, we have this header component. And this header component is basically a rendering of our header.js file. And we want to pass in through props, which is just properties, a title. And in order to do that from our app.js, similar to the way we added styles, we can create a title prop. So this is a customized prop that we created ourselves. And as Ellen mentioned earlier, with these curly braces, we're basically passing in JavaScript. But in this case, this is just going to be a string. We actually don't need these. We can just go ahead and make title equal to, in our case, it would be a to-do list. So we can just call it to-do list. And what that'll do is it'll pass in this props.title through and then have it render here. So if we can go ahead and check our app again, it's going to say to-do list, because from the app.js, we passed in to-do list and then we got this right here. So now that we have the header for our to-do list, we can go ahead and actually create the individual components that would become the list items. So in order to do that, within our components folder, we're going to want to create a new file and then have that be the list items.js file. And from here, we're going to want to perform some of the similar imports. So you want to import React from React. And then here, we're going to be also using style sheet, text view, and we're going to be using a button as well. So you want to import those from React Native.
So we'll want the file to be named list item since it'll just be representing one item at this time.
Yes, I apologize. Let me go ahead and rename that just to be list item. Okay, perfect. And then in the same way we did for our header, all we're going to want to do is export default function list item. And then in the similar, we're going to want to pass in props. And then from here, we're going to want to return We can return the similar, we can have the view, and then within the view, we can contain the text, just so we can kind of get that started and rendered. And then in addition, for our list item, we're also going to want a button. So this button will later be used to toggle whether an item is done or not. We'll definitely go into that later, but for now, we'll just have this view, this text, and this button. So for the text, what's actually inside of it, similar to the way we did our header, we can just also do props.title. And then for the view, we're gonna, and the text and the button, we're gonna be later adding a styles. So I'm gonna go ahead and just copy from our repository the style sheet that we're gonna be using.
Right, so while David's doing that, you might notice that the setup for this component is pretty similar to our header. The major difference is going to be functionality we add later, and then also using styling to kind of create a different visual effect.
So you will later see what all these are used for, but for now we can just go ahead and apply the correct styles. So for the text, we're going to want to add the style property. And then from here, you can actually, it is possible to implement multiple styles. So I can implement container and item text, or is done container and is done text to a certain element. All you have to do is contain them inside of an array. So within this, within the brackets, we're going to want within the curly braces, we're going to want the brackets. And so all we're going to do is the same thing, styles.item text. And then we're also going to, for now, we're just going to have styles.isNotDone text. So if you look below, those are going to correspond to these two, this item text and this is not done text. So they will both be applied to this text. And then same with the view, we can go ahead and add the styles for that, which will be within the array. We're going to have styles.container and styles.isNotDone container. And then we can go ahead and go back to our app where we can render this list item. So similar to the way this is, we can go ahead and add that, but instead we're going to import list item from components/list item. And then here we're free to create our list item component. And then since for the list item, we're relying on the text is relying on the props right here. Sorry if you can't see that. The text is relying on the props. We're going to want to pass that in. So in the same way, title equals, and then here we can just pass in one of the to-do list items. So eat lunch. So before we return the header and list item, you're only allowed to return one element. So we're just going to want to create, contain that in a single view, and then we can copy paste those into there. So we're going to want these in here, and so we don't get any errors. So let's go ahead and check up on our Expo app. Let's see what happens. It should be refreshing, and then we get this to-do list, and this is going to be our header. And then this is our item, and then this is going to be our button, which we'll later style and work with. So for now, we just have these two components, and then yes, we'll go back to our list item. So one thing that for our list item that we're going to be adding is state, and Elle can go ahead and explain that for us.
Yeah, so since this is a to-do list, we'll probably want something like, say, the ability to check off an item. So for that, we'll use React State. Again, if you're coming from React.js, state will sound very familiar. It is the same in React Native as it is in JS. State is effectively a component's personal data storage. It lets every component store any number of variables or information that it needs to. It's useful for handling data that changes over time, such as whether a to-do task is done or not, or information that might come from user interaction, which we'll see later. Whenever you update state, you have to do it a certain way, because when state is updated, it will actually re-render that component and everything it's rendering as well. Finally, we'll talk about this a little more in detail when we see a class component later, but state is handled differently in functional and class components. So we'll see how state looks like in a functional component right now, but then later we'll see how it looks like in a class. So David's going to go ahead and add in what we need to set up a state for this list item component so that it can keep track of whether this list item is done or not. So David, if you want to take it from here.
Yeah, so first we're going to want to import this use state. So that because this is a functional component, it will be using this use state hook. And basically what we're going to want to do is at the very beginning, before we return anything, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set the state. So basically the way that state works in a functional component is you create a constant and then it is an array. So the array contains two things. The first thing is the state we're going to want to alter for the list items is going to be whether it is done or not. So the first thing will be is done, and then the second thing will be set is done. So I can go ahead and explain that a little bit. So the first item is actually what you're keeping track of, whether it is done or whether it is not done. So it'll be altered back and forth, and then set is done is the method that's going to be used in order to alter the is done. So when you first set it up, you're going to want to create this array and then make it equal to use state. And then for now, we can just make it equal to true. So, or we can make it, yeah. So for now, is done is equal to true. So anywhere where you input is done, it's going to be true. And if you want to change is done to be false, you use set is done. That's basically the layout of kind of state and how we're going to use it.
All right, so now we've set up our is done state. We're going to start adding in the code that's actually going to use this state and alter it the way we want to in this app. So to start out, let's make it so that our button on press actually is able to change the state. So you'll see that David here is using on press, which is a built-in sort of attribute of the button. You can look up all the attributes that you can use and how they should be used in the React documentation, which you can find online.
So on the press, we're going to want to set is done, which is what I mentioned up here, to be what's going to alter this is done state. So we're going to want to call set is done, and then we're going to want to set it. So within this parentheses is what you're going to input what you want it to change. So for us, we want it to just be the opposite of what it is now. So if is done is true, we want it to be false and vice versa. So we can just go ahead and put the exclamation point, which will be the opposite. And then this will just on press set it equal to the opposite of what it currently is.
And we'll need to make this a lambda as well to make sure that we're not just calling set is done, we're actually creating a lambda or a local function that will get called when you press the button. All right. Next, David is going to go ahead and add in styling for our view, text, and button elements so that they kind of display the way we expect to, depending on what our is done state variable is equal to. This is by no means necessary, but in this case, we'll use it to kind of create a nice effect for our to-do list.
So virtually what this is doing is for the styles, it is always implementing the styles.container, and then it's checking, is it done? Then it's going to apply this. If not, it's going to apply this.
Right. You may notice that we can use is done just directly like it's a local variable because that is what it is, although it is specifically reflecting this important state variable that can change.
We also want the text on the button to change. So if you notice for the title, we're going to check if it's done. If it is, we're going to mark incomplete. That's going to be what the text says. Else, mark done. So if we take a look at this, our actual app here, notice that when you click on the button, it changes the style because the state itself is being changed. So actually here we are starting off with the wrong state. So we always want to start off with is done equal to false in this case. So we can go ahead and refresh that so we can see the changes. So this is what it's going to originally look like when we want to mark it done. This is what it looks like when it's complete, and then we mark it complete. So I can go ahead and first, let's just create a bunch of these list items and then see what it looks like. So you just create a bunch of eat lunch list items that are being rendered on our app.js. If you notice, we have all these different list items, and the cool thing you'll notice is each one has an independent state. So this list item state is completely independent of this one. And this makes it really easy for us to kind of change the state of an individual item. So yeah, so now that we have our two most important components, which are the header and the list item, both of which are functional components, we're going to go ahead and introduce the list screen, which will actually hold our list items in our headers, and it'll give us the ability to add new ones and make sure that we're rendering correctly and add other functionality as well. And this list screen will actually be a class component, which we'll go into. Good.
All right, so now that we have our list item and header set up, let's go ahead and make a kind of containing class that'll allow us to do some more exciting things like add list items while we have the app open and things like that. So David's going to go ahead and make our list screen JS file. List screen is just going to be our name for this containing class. And like David mentioned, we're going to make this a class component instead of a functional component. So we're going to start out by importing mostly the same things with the added addition of needing to import component from React.
So that component import allows us to make a class component and then use it as a functional component, as you had seen earlier. And for here, we're going to be using a lot of different things. We're going to be using a text input, a button, a scroll view, and like always, a style sheet. And then we're also going to want to import the header. And then you can see the path is a little different because this is already within the components file. And then we're also going to want to import the list item. Okay.
All right. So now to actually set up this component, instead of just returning a single function, like the name implies, we're going to make a class. So we'll go ahead and make a JavaScript class, name it list screen, so it matches our file name. And then we'll want to extend component because this is a type of React component. That'll also give us the kind of inherited methods we'll need to make this work. All right, so simply put, a state component really only has two pieces that you need to implement. One is the constructor. Technically, in some cases, you could ignore this as well, but this is the function that's going to get called when we make this component to render. So for now, our constructor will just take in props and not really do anything with those. But you can see that this is the place where you would deal with props, just like in a functional component, you deal with them as input to the function. All right, the next most important part of this component is a render function. So in a functional component, the whole component is really a render function. In this case, it's a separate function we'll be putting in the class like David just did. And in this case, we'll want to render our header and one or more list items just as a sample. And just
so we will,
go ahead.
Yeah, so we'll also want to contain it within the view as we had done earlier. In the same way, we can just input the header, and then I'm going to go ahead and copy over all the styles. Ellie, if you want to talk about the exports as well, we'll get into that.
Right, so in order to use a class component, well, I need to add one extra line at the bottom of our file, which is exporting this class so that it has the same function as the export default we put before the functional component. We'll just need to add an export default to the bottom of our list screen file. David there just copied all of the styling code as well, which again, you can grab from our repo so that our styling is correct. And then from this point on, using the list screen is going to be very similar to using any of our functional components. In a lot of cases, the difference between a class and a functional component is not huge. It kind of depends on what you're trying to do with it. For something like the list screen, which we know is going to have a lot of parts and probably a lot of helper functions, we're going to make it a class component to just, because a class will support all of those in a kind of cleaner and better way. But like we've seen, you can use state and other things like that with functional components now. So there's not a huge difference in most cases, whether you use a class or a functional component.
So in the same way as our app, here we're also going to be passing in the titles so that we can assign those as props within the list item and the header components themselves. So we can keep eat lunch. And then what we're going to want to do is currently right now our app.js has these header and list item components. But since we created this kind of wrapper class that contains both the list item and the header, we can just go ahead and render the list screen within our app.js, and that'll simplify it and make it a lot easier for us. So within our app.js, we're going to want to import list. Sorry, we're going to want to import this screen from /components/list screen. And then we can just return a component that's list screen. Given that we no longer need this style sheet here, since everything is going to be contained within the list screen, we also don't need any of this, don't need the status bar. We only need this right here, this very simple app.js.
One last thing before we go ahead and render this is when we use the constructor for a class component, we need to make sure to include super props at the top of our constructor. It's not really important. Most of the times this doesn't change the way our class is behaving, but it is important to making sure that this code compiles. So if we do that and run that, we'll notice our styling is a little odd, but we are seeing the same components as before. So to fix the styling, let's go ahead and just add some basically decorative views. So we'll add a scroll view that wraps our list items, which will kind of put the list items in their own scrollable box. Excuse me. And this is coming from, or scroll view is one of the default or packaged components coming from React Native. So you always have access to this, and there's really great documentation on the React docs website about what you can do with scroll view. There's a lot of options.
So the styles will be the styles.item container. So we can go ahead and refresh and then see if there's any differences. So we are getting this error. It's saying that the scroll view is not defined. A lot of times this could come from import errors. So we see here that we just spelled scroll view wrong. And then if we go ahead and refresh, we should be able to correctly render a certain item. There you go. So right now we have a built-in header. We have a list item, and then we have the working button functionality. So what we're going to want to add is we're going to want a user to be able to input their own to-do list items. So in order to do that, we're going to work on inputting a text input.
All right, so in order to do that, we need to import the components we're trying to use, which we've already done in advance. So we'll go ahead and just add a nice containing view for this section of our app. And then once we've added in the view, which again is just sort of a decorative container for styling purposes, we'll go ahead and add inside of it, once David's done typing in the styles, we'll add a text input component, which is a built-in component coming from React Native that is the same as an input field in HTML. It's going to be just a small text box that you can type in on a phone. So just like the other built-in components that are coming from React Native, text input comes with a bunch of built-in sort of props and attributes you can use to make it behave in different fun ways. We won't go through all of them. We'll just be using a few of the most commonly used ones, such as placeholder, for example, is one which lets you customize what text is going to show up in the text input while or before you start typing in it. All right, so next we're going to add a button. So this will be sort of the submit button for this input field. You can on a phone submit by pressing enter, but for accessibility purposes, it's also good to include an actual clickable button. So in this case, we'll just be giving it a title for now, and we'll come back to these elements to talk about how we'll add the actual functionality we want to them. We're going to go ahead and refresh our preview and be able to see that we now have a text box with our placeholder text and an add task button. I'm going to talk about state in a class component. State in a class component works similarly from a function standpoint as it does in a functional component. The only difference is going to be how we actually implement it. So to start out, what's pretty typical is in our constructor, we'll add a line where we set the state of the object. State kind of behaves like a field variable for the whole class. So we'll refer to it using this.state. And state is also an object, a JavaScript object with multiple fields. In this case, let's go ahead and add in a state variable or state field for the input text, which is going to just represent what text is currently inside of the input text box. So we'll leave it as empty for now, because when we start out our program, we don't want any input text in our box. This is going to help us later, so we might not immediately see why we need to do this, but let's go ahead and add a field to our text input component so that it's using the value from the state instead of starting out with just a blank value. So we can refer to variables from our state just by saying this.state dot whatever the variable is, and we can use them that way. One important thing to note is that you may store something mutable inside of a state field, but you should never mutate it directly by using this.state. For example, if it's an array, you shouldn't say this.state dot array.pop. You shouldn't directly access it like that. Instead, let's go ahead and add a function that will be called whenever we change what's in this text input field. So we'll want to use the onChangeText sort of attribute of a text input to do that. And whenever we change the text in this text input box, what we'll want to do is update our state. So with a class component, instead of using a state update function like the one we saw in a functional component, we'll actually want to call a function called this.setState, which will change the state but based on what you're passing into it. And it's a little particular about what goes in those brackets. You don't need to retype the whole state. You don't need to set every state variable at once. Whichever fields you do change in the input to set state are the only ones that are going to change. So in this case, we only want to change input text to whatever the text we're getting from the text input is. So we'll just change that field. Next, we want to render all of our to-do items kind of dynamically instead of having to type them in manually in our list screen object. So let's go ahead into our original state initialization and add in a state variable for the items in our to-do list. So we'll call this items, and we'll set it to an empty array to start. And this will be all of the items in our to-do list, which we can, because it's an array, update and change as time goes on. All right, so the first thing we'll need to do now, or to integrate this functionality into our program, is let's go ahead and add a function that actually lets us add a task to this list. So we'll make this function something like add task item, and we'll have it taken as input the name of the task that we're adding.
So in a class component, you want to write all the helper methods that help with the rendering above the render method itself. So you don't want, this isn't a method that you want to render. It's something that'll help decide what you're going to be eventually rendering. So you can just write it as if it's a method within the class, below the constructor, but above the render method itself.
All right, so first, in order to make sure we're not accidentally adding a bunch of blank tasks, let's check that our task name is actually a non-empty string. And then what we'll want to do is, once we've checked that, if it isn't an empty string and we're ready to actually add a task, we'll make an object for this task. The reason we need an object is because we're going to find later that our tasks are going to have quite some information attached to them besides just the task name. To start though, let's just add the name of the task as one of the fields of this object. And then once we've made this object, we can go ahead and change our state by adding this object to the items list or items array. So like I mentioned before, state is meant to be immutable. Whenever you want to change the state, you must use the set state function. So we're going to be, instead of using the traditional sort of JavaScript array pop and push here, we're going to be using concat to add this task to our existing array list and basically making a new array for the item's state variable instead of mutating the one that already exists. This is technically not necessary. You could make it work the other way around with actually mutating the item's variable, but you need to call set state in order to re-render the component, or else your component will change or your state variables will change, but you won't actually see a change in the rendered final product. We're also going to quickly set input text to an empty string here so that when we actually add new tasks, our input box will clear. All right, so now that we have the add task item function, let's go ahead and add this function to our text input so that when we actually submit something, this function gets called and the item that we've typed out in our text input box gets added to our to-do list.
So one of the properties that come with the text input element is called onSubmitEditing. So basically this will run each time you hit enter or you submit your text. And so what we want is to call this .add task item, which is the method we just wrote. And then remember how within the this.add task item, we passed in the variable task name. So the good thing is what the task name at this point is going to be is actually going to be our this.state.input text.
Right, and notice we refer to add task item using this since it is a class method.
So in addition to being able to submit on clicking enter for the text input, we also want it to be possible for you to just click the button and submit in that way as well. So within the button, we can have a on press like we did before. And then here we just have another Lambda function. And then it's just called, it does the same thing where it's this.add task item. And then we still pass in the this.state.input text. So now we have a way of using this text input and this button in order to create these objects, these JavaScript objects that contain the task name. And now what we want to do is take those objects and actually render a bunch of list items from it. So we can go ahead and start by creating a render items method.
Right, so this method will be rendering the array of objects that we've stored in our state into actual list item components that we can see. So to do this, we'll take our state item variable and map over it to convert each of those JavaScript objects into a rendered list item component. So we'll see here that we're going to take each item in this.state.items, and the same way we would in a render method, we're just going to return a version of the list item component with whatever necessary props we need. So we'll say return, and then using the angle brackets, like with the other components, write list item, and then add in the props we need, which in this case is just the name of the list item task or the to-do task. One thing to note is that when you're rendering components like this, you're creating a bunch of almost identical or very similar components. React encourages you to add a key to all of these components. So let's go ahead and do that right now. What we'll do is basically add a counter to our class so that we can assign a unique number or a unique primary key to each of our list items. So yeah, we'll start the key at 0, and then every time we add an item, we'll make sure it gets a field in its JavaScript object called key that's corresponding to whatever ID we've assigned it, and then we'll make sure we're incrementing key over time. If you don't do this, you will get a warning in the console, which will not stop you from compiling your code, but it's a good practice to add things like keys when you're rendering a bunch of similar components in an array style like we are here.
As you notice here, we passed in title in the same way we've been passing in title for all the list items. And then we're also going to want to input the key. So let's have key, and then this will be the particular item dot the key. So what this is doing is it's taking that array of items and it's mapping each one to a list item itself, and it's returning that.
So next, finally, to make sure that all of these items are not only being rendered, but being rendered in the important place, which is the render function, let's go into a render function and replace all of those hard-coded list items we had, it might only be one, with a call to this render items function, which will return an array of actual dynamically rendered list item components.
Yeah, so if you can see, it's contained within the curly brackets, which indicates that there will be JavaScript inside. And the cool thing is you can just call this method, and since it's able to return this list of list items, it'll just render that straight here.
Right. And so now that we have that all set up, do we want to take a look at our final product? I shouldn't say final. Our intermediate product.
Yeah, as you can see with the input of the text, what it does is it'll, when I'm putting in a task, what it's doing is it's changing the input text state. And then when I click enter, what that's doing, as we had coded, was it's calling that add list item. And then each time that you add a list item, the whole thing is re-rendered, and you're getting this, you're getting a new item in the list.
Great. So now that we can add new to-do items to our list whenever we want using our text input and button, let's go ahead and add a new function to this list, which is, let's say, the ability to toggle whether or not we are able to see tasks that are already complete. So, you might want to turn this on if you have a bunch of tasks that are done and you don't want to see them anymore. So to do that, David, what are we going to have to add?
So the best way we think we can implement this is kind of using a button. And this button will basically toggle between show all of the items and then only show the items that are not done. So we can go ahead and input a button here. And then from here, on press of this button, so in order to keep track of whether we should show whether something's done or not, we're going to want to add something to our state. So right now our state just has the input text and the items. And so for now, we're going to want to also include something called a show done. So this show done is basically going to be the state that is toggled by that button. And then we can start off by making it true. So we want to show everything to start with. And then what we're going to do is with the button. So when we click on the button, we're going to want to toggle that, right? So within our button, we can have an on press. And then similar to the way we kind of change the state of the on change text, we're going to also change the state of the show done. So we'll have a lambda method here. And then what it does is it calls this dot set state, the same way we've been doing it. And then within here, we have show done. And then what we're going to set it is whatever the opposite of what it currently is. So it's going to be opposite of this dot state dot show done. And what basically this does is every time the button is clicked, what it's going to do is it's going to toggle that state. And then in a similar way, we also have a particular style for this button. So I can go ahead and input the style for that to be styles.button. And then finally, we're going to want to change what the button says. So in order to do that, we can actually have text be another thing that we keep track of in our state. So we can call it show done text. And then to begin with, we want everything to be shown. We want to show even the done tasks. So initially the button would say hide done tasks, right? And then every time the button is clicked, we're going to want to change that. So what we're going to have is within our button, we will have a title property. And then this will be dependent on whether the state of show done is true or false. So we can check by doing this.state.show done. And if it is true, then we want to keep it at hide done tasks. And if it's false, we want to have it say show done tasks. So now that we have all this implemented, we can go ahead and go to our app and then see if we can get the new button. Right, so here we have the hide done tasks button. That's going to be the initial kind of text for it. And then let's say we add eat lunch. And then this should, we haven't implemented the functionality yet, but this should later hide and show the tasks.
Next, in order to add the functionality of this button in, we're going to have to change up our internal representation of our to-do list a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to start by changing what the items in this.state.items look like. So we're going to go to the add task item function and add a new field to our new task, or basically every object we're adding for each task. That's called is done. This will keep track of whether the task is done or not and let us easily check if a task has been completed or not so that we can render or not render it based on that information. Is done is going to start as false since all of our tasks are initially not done. All right, next, in order to kind of accommodate this change, in render items, we're going to make sure to pass this information to list item as a prop. So we'll give list item a new prop called is done. And in a second, we'll change list item to accommodate this prop as well. So is done is going to be equal to the is done field of the item that we're currently rendering. And then in the list item class, we'll quickly add support for this prop. So the way we'll do that is we'll make sure that the is done state doesn't always start as false. Rather, we'll make sure it starts as whatever it was given to it as a prop. So in this case, we would be looking for the is done prop coming from the props input. Great. So now that our list item is using the prop is done to set its own is done sort of state, let's go to list screen and add a function that will pass to list item so that list item can actually toggle the state of list screen. Because remember, our list screen .state.items array is what's going to actually keep track of the done status of these list items in order to make sure that we can correctly implement that filter function we added a while ago. All right, so to do that, let's add in a method that will pass to list item, which will be called toggle done, and it'll take in the key or ID of the specific task that is being toggled. So pretty simply, this function will just need to create a new item and kind of overwrite what that item used to be in our array. So to do that, we'll map over this.state.items. And what we'll do is for each item in this.state.items, if it's the item we're trying to find, so if its key matches the input key to toggle done, we will create or mutate that object so that its is done status is toggled. And what this is going to do is create a new array of all the items in our old state items list or array that has that one item that we're being referred to by the key toggled in terms of its is done status. So once we finish up the map function, and we're making sure we're sort of correctly returning the item in our map, we can finally set state and just replace the old items array with this new items array that we just created. Right, and remember, we want to use set state here instead of directly mutating the array so that the entire component actually knows it might need to re-render itself, which is what we want in this case and in most cases. All right, so now that we have this function, we want to actually, or method, we want to actually pass it to list item as we're rendering them as a prop so that list item can access this method and use it to change the state of list screen when someone presses that mark as complete or mark incomplete button. So to do that, we'll give list item another prop, which will be this function. So we'll call toggle done just to match, and it will be quite literally just the function that we're providing to, this component. So since we already know what the key for each item is, it's contained in the object, we'll directly pass in item.key as the input to this function. Great. So now let's go take a look at list item and add in code so that we're actually using this toggle done function when the button is pressed. So to do that, we now want to do a bunch of things when we're calling on press for the button. So we'll just go ahead and quickly add a helper function that we'll call on press that'll handle everything we need to do for us. So we'll call it handle done. And all we'll be doing here is setting is done, just like we've been doing before with on press. And then also calling the, I'll wait till David finishes this line, right? Calling the toggle done function we were passed in as a prop so that the array in list screen is correctly updated when someone hits this button. So this is an example of where we want two different components to pass information between each other or communicate with each other. So we're doing that by passing in the relevant methods as props and letting the different components call them. You can definitely get very creative with this and do a lot of really cool stuff in React.js with it, React Native, also React.js, but that's what we're doing here.
We do need to change the on press. So rather than the original set is done, we just need to call this whole handle done method. So we can go ahead and do that, handle done. And then, so every time you're on press, you can handle it. And then we can go ahead and, like Elle mentioned, work on actually filtering it so that we can properly return what we want.
Right, exactly. So to do that, all we'll do is change render item so it behaves a little differently when our show done status has been toggled. So we'll do that by adding in an if statement right here in our map that's checking if the state of this component has show done set to true. If it does, have show done set to true, we don't have to worry about filtering out anything. So that'll be kind of the first part of this if statement. And after David moves this block, we'll see in order to make sure that components that aren't or are done and we don't want to be, and that don't need to be rendered when the state show done variable is set to false, we'll add an or here and then check if the item is done, which means that we can do bang.isDone to check if it's done, because that would be the opposite. Okay, so what this is, if the item is complete and our state show done kind of toggle variable is set to false, then the item will not be returned from this lambda and will not render at all in our final array that we're returning from rendered items.
So this should be the final piece to correctly work with the toggle functionality to only show the list items that we want. So we can go ahead and test that out with our app. We can go to refresh. So let's add a task like eat lunch. And then we can click that button, or we can also hit enter. Run, walk, dog, and then do homework. So we have all these different items, and we can mark this one as done, and we can mark this one as done. And then currently, since we haven't changed the state of whether we want to show our finished tasks, it'll show everything. And then when we want to hide done tasks, it'll only show run and do homework. And then we can click it, toggle it again, and it'll re-render the eat lunch and walk dog ones. Change the state of this, and it only gets rid of the eat lunch. So overall, this is basically our final project. This is what we wanted to include. It has the basic build of a React project with Expo, with the components, with state, with props. Also includes text input, buttons, the scroll view, and then kind of incorporating all that to create this final product.
All right, so that's kind of the entirety of our intro to React Native and all the different parts of it. So next we'll talk about kind of the final steps if you're working on your own React Native project. One important step is deployment. So once you're done with the project, you don't want to just deploy the development build that we've been working on this whole time. We'll actually want to properly build like a deployed package. So you could do that with something like the command expo build Android or iOS, to build to whatever platform you're trying to deploy on, or both. For the most up-to-date information, we recommend you take a look directly at the Expo docs, which will give you a very in-depth breakdown of what you need to do to deploy for whichever platform or method you're trying to deploy your app on.
And for more information, you should definitely check out the React Native docs. They have tons of tutorials, tons of examples where you can go more in depth into the different types of user interactions, just to create a more customized kind of native app. And there's definitely tons of different cool things you can build. And this is just a little sneak peek into React Native in general. So.
Right, so that has been our React Native workshop. We hope that you learned a lot from it. Again, all of the code that we've been working on will be available in a repo, so you can copy and paste or reference it later if needed. Thanks for coming and checking this out.
Thank you.
Everyone.